Fáilte go dtí an episód sa Ceist na Teangan. Podcréil Finghin Mac agus a star de aine atá fistrup faoi our gadrúh léithí agus a role in our bhéiniúlacht. Welcome to the Language Question, a podcast about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about our relationship with it and its role in our identity. Maris Gnách, bí cinnte a chlárú ag thelanguagequestion.com/resources chun de acmhaní fálam to Saoire Naisce a all agus a bheith ar an eolas faoi gachród atá ar siúl ar an show. As usual, please be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to be sure to get your complimentary, valuable learning resources and to stay up to date, upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Peish Gael, Shulling, Gomwena tú soltas. Anyhow, here goes. I hope you enjoy it.
Príomh-Aimime Gael Linn Réamonn Ó Ciaráin. Réamonn is Chief Executive of Gael Linn. He worked with Gael Linn since 1993, progressing to manager in 2003, Director of Education in 2020, and he has been in the role of Chief Executive since 2022. He holds a degree in Education and Celtic Studies from St Mary's University College Belfast and an MA in Irish Studies from Queen's University Belfast. He also has an MA in Cultural Management from the Ulster University in Jordanstown. He is co-founder and chair of Éannacha Waka, the new Conturlan in Armagh City. Réamonn has authored 3 books on Cuchulainn and the Ulster Cycle, which were published by Gael Linn, as well as articles in many publications. Réamonn a chara, tá fáilte is fiche rót ar an show agus tá thar a bheith buíoch díot as a bheith linn.
Gur a céad maige tá mé ansona a bheith an seo ag lóirt leat a innín.
Well, tá míid ag súil go mór leis agus tá fáilte rót. Réamonn, what I would love to do, as I do here at the beginning of these conversations with all of our guests, is just go back to the very, very start of your experience with and journey in the Irish language. And how did that look like for you growing up? What was that like growing up, coming up through education and so on? What was your experience of growing up with Irish?
Well, I was brought up in Crossmaglen, born in the late 60s. And, in the north, in the education system, you don't have to study Irish at all. And sadly, many boys and girls don't get the opportunity to study Irish for, I suppose, social reasons, geographical reasons, political reasons. And in that regard, I really wouldn't have come into contact with the Irish language much until later on in my primary school, when a lovely lady, Mrs. Cassidy, taught us Irish. And it was almost a treat that Mrs. Cassidy did with us, all those boys and girls, maybe 36 in the one class, on the Carron Road in Crossmaglen. So on a Thursday afternoon, we got the opportunity to do Irish, and it was a treat. Let's forget all the other stuff, the English, the maths, the history, and we're now going to do Irish, boys and girls. And it was great. And I can still remember the book that she used was Bí a Gléú, and we all responded very well to learning Irish with Mrs. Cassidy, and it was something that she did voluntarily. And, as well as that exposure to the Irish language in primary school, the local GAA club, Crossmaglen Rangers, held some Irish language classes, and I can remember making my way in the Newry Road, across the square, and up to the Rangers Hall, I think it was. And that teacher was Grania Clark, and she taught Irish in a very enjoyable way. I can remember her using the song, I Met the Mayor of Dublin in the town the other day, and he spoke in Irish to the person he met, and they were a wee bit embarrassed that they couldn't respond in Irish. And we learned that song. And bizarrely, the first words I can remember learning in Irish were Súil Gú, meaning a black eye, because one boy came into the class and he had a black eye for whatever reason. And that stuck in my mind. It just shows you the importance of getting the right learning resources.
We won't go there.
It doesn't have to be as extreme as a black eye. But then the thing about that was, if you bear in mind that there is no compunction on any boy and girl to learn Irish or any school to offer Irish at that time, we were lucky to get the exposure we did. And then I went to the Abbey Grammar in Newry, and for no great effort on my own behalf, I was catapulted towards the top of the class just because I had that extra exposure to the Irish language at primary level. And I had excellent teachers in the Abbey Grammar. Hughie Murphy, who's a renowned poet, taught me at the start and then again at the end when I did A-level. And one interesting thing about Hughie Murphy was that if you were studying any subject now, it would be very examination orientated. But with him, he spent the first 2 weeks of our A-level course teaching us about the history of the Irish language, folklore, the mythology, and nobody was allowed to write anything down. You just sat and listened. And in his twist of fate, that fortnight where he wanted to inspire the hearts of the boys in front of him probably ended up having the greatest influence on me in terms of the Irish language. So the Irish language carried me through my education, really. It was my strongest subject. I went on and studied to be a teacher in Irish, and those postgraduate degrees I did, they were all related to the language or culture. And, no matter how much I contribute to the Irish language, I'll never contribute as much as the Irish language has given me over the years, because I now work full-time, as you said, in the Irish language.
No, it's an extraordinary story, and it's extraordinarily self-effacing of you to put that like that. But and it's a wonderfully inspirational way of putting it. But could you just, because that's a fascinating story, and I just want to maybe just pick a little bit more into that in terms of what that looked like. Because just roughly, what stage in primary school, you said it wasn't have been just at the beginning of primary school, it was at a certain point that you started doing the voluntary lessons with the lady. Can you remember what age that would have been roughly, or?
Yeah, that would have been, I would have been about 8 or 9 years old. And another, now that you mention it, another memory is coming to the fore, and that would have been, we tended to answer the role in Irish, and we knew how to say anseo, or Níl sé anseo, or Níl sí anseo, and we also knew how to say some prayers. And I remember a priest coming to our school. Canon Kelly was his name, and he was, I suppose, trying to recruit for the priesthood. And I remember a boy, I'm not going to say his name, but I do know his name, and I'm not going to say it. Let's call him Paul. Paul said that he would love more than anything to become a priest, but he didn't think that he would be able to learn enough Irish to be a priest. So back then, saying some of the prayers in Irish was important to our community, and it required those going on to the priesthood to be at least open to learning enough Irish. So I was 8, 9 when I first gained some exposure to the Irish language in a very fun way and through song. And, then when I went to secondary school in Newry, which was an hour-long journey in the bus in the morning and an hour-long journey in the evening, the Irish language was definitely probably my only strong subject. I managed to get by in all the others, but for some reason, the Irish language got me, captured me, and I haven't regretted that for a moment.
Of course. Because I am fascinated by this, because I want to come back to education, because education is such a controversial kind of topic now in the conversation around the Irish language here in the South particularly. But your story there is an extraordinarily positive one. Was it one class a week you had in primary school?
Oh, about that, yeah. Yeah.
And then of the cohort who, let's say, maybe there was we had large, I was in the early 70s, you were in the late 60s, you were in large class sizes. Of the cohort that all had exposure to this, how many do you think continued on or were bit by the bug in the same way that you were? Was that a phenomenon? Were many other people taken with Irish similar to yourself?
Well, there were a number of schools in South Armagh, Crossmaglen, St. Patrick's, Crossmaglen, St. Patrick's Cullyhanna, and another school in Forkill. And the boys and girls who went to those schools ended up being better at Irish at their respective schools. They all remained loyal to that initial love of the Irish language and would have gone on to do O-level, as it was. It's now GCSE, but it was O-level in my time. And incidentally, I have taken the time to look back at some of the O-level papers that we had to do, and they're similar to the papers that you might see, well up the educational ladder, even at university level. It's worth saying that, yes, I had a very positive exposure to the Irish language at school, in the community, even though it was reasonably light. I then went to the Gaeltacht. When I was 13, there was some scholarships available. I was lucky enough to win one of those, and I went to Ranafast when I was 13. I was very small, and the others seemed to be giant. And, it's impossible to be in the Gaeltacht for 3 weeks, as it was at that time, in and around 1982 or 83, and not absorb a lot of the language. And that helped me even more, to be that wee bit better when I went back to school. I would have to add the wonderful summers I spent in the Gaeltacht on really convincing me that the Irish language was going to be an important pillar in my education and, as it turns out, in my life.
Yeah, and again, I would just like to dig a little bit deeper into this, because I think it's fascinating in terms of the kind of the base that it created in you, and it's palpable, the influence, the positive influence the language had on you. But what was it like outside of school? In your family, was there an attitude to the Irish language at home, or was it something that existed was there a context outside of school, should we say?
Well, that's a very good question. And my grandfather, on my mother's side, Mick O'Hanlon, was born, I think it was in and around a townland called De Burn, outside Newry in South Armagh. And in the census reports, it was noted against him that he spoke Irish and English, even though I never heard him speaking Irish. When he was a boy, he was a bilingual. And the Irish language survived into the 60s in South Armagh, and definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, the Irish language can be heard in the English language of South Armagh. In fact, I remember working in London when I was a university student, and I heard one of my fellow Crossmaglen young men, saying, "I'm going to go home now, throw myself down and lie up And, a person not from Ireland would have difficulty understanding that, but we thought it was just so natural. So there's a lot of Irish in the English that we speak. And I was aware that for sure there were a lot of Irish language words. But to bring it closer to my own family, my father had excellent Irish and he spoke it a fair amount. In fact, some of the local GAA clubs used to get him to translate the names of the participants because they had to be registered in Irish, and that was one thing that he always did. And he was a teacher, he was a PE teacher, but I suppose he had as great a love for the language, and I absorbed that. But as often happens, the children of teachers are a wee bit like the children of cobblers. They can have the worst shoes in the parish, even though their father is a cobbler. My father, he could have taught all his children a lot of Irish, but he was exhausted after teaching during the day. But I did detect a huge love for the language and its heritage. There were 7 children in our house, and nearly all of us went on to have a great love for Irish and study it at a relatively high level. And so there was a respect for the language, but not everybody had that respect in the community. There was more respect for the sport and music. And, when I was growing up in Crossmaglen, which was a nationalist village, it was a very Irish village. People sometimes were too busy at pursuing other activities like sports and like the music and even dance. And Irish, there was the sense that maybe it was too late for the Irish language back then. And you would have heard people saying, what's the point? It's a dead language. And thankfully, I can report today that I never hear anybody saying that, but I heard it a lot when I was young. I had friends say to me, oh, you don't have to speak Irish to be Irish. And they believe that, and to a certain level, they were right. But now I think most people have come round to valuing the Irish language again. Maybe it's because we've moved that bit further on our journey, our post-colonial journey, if you like, where we're beginning to realise that no, our culture is important, our language is vital, and it's part of what makes us who we are.
Completely. Just on that, I'm just very curious because you mentioned that a lot of your family members were learned Irish to a reasonably high level, and your dad was a very good speaker. Did you speak it to one another?
Not when I was a child, but later when I went on to work in Gael Linn and demonstrate that my Irish language credentials were of a certain caliber, then he insisted at times to speak in Irish to me, and that was grand, and I appreciated that additional connection with my father. And another important element that we haven't mentioned, I couldn't have gone to a Gael school when I was a child because they didn't exist. The first one began in the north, on Shaw's Road, Belfast. I believe it was maybe 72, and I would have started school in 73. But my primary school, St. Patrick's Primary School, Carn Road, Crossmaglen, is now also a Fádrigh Nifa. And the sons and daughters of my sisters, my brothers, some of them, and the following generation also are definitely going to the Gael school. And that's another example of how the Irish language has grown. My own daughter, for example, I couldn't go to a Gael school, But my daughter went to a Gael school and she had a wonderful experience. Then she went on to secondary level, mainly Irish medium education. She did some science subjects through English, and then she went on to Queen's, and she's finishing up now Irish and Spanish at Queen's. There weren't so many opportunities for me and the Irish language, or my generation and the Irish language, but that the opposite is the case now. There are so many opportunities, work-wise, socially, culturally, relating to the Irish language. And the trajectory indicates that it's going to grow and grow. And the Irish people, north and south, and scattered across the globe, and those who have no actual connection to Ireland, but just love the music, the dance, and the language, there's going to be more and more interest in our rich, ancient, but very modern language and culture.
Gone out, and it's down to the work that people like you are doing on behalf of the language to contribute to all of that. But to speak, because you mentioned that your daughter now going to, because I'm just very interested in the crossover between your experience in education and then subsequently in working in the language and what that looks like outside of the education work context. And that was fascinating. So thank you for sharing that relationship with your dad. But what about then with you said your daughter went to a girls' school and then to a secondary school, predominantly Irish language medium. Would you use Irish at home between yourselves? Is it a language that did you raise your children in Irish, for instance? Is it a language of the household?
Well, my wife, when she was pregnant with Alana, was doing a diploma in Irish, which she passed, and we speak a lot of Irish in the house. But the first words I spoke to Alana were definitely in Irish. And I have this sense that I spoke far more Irish to Alana when she was 0 to about 2.5. And then she went to school, and not that I'm blaming her childminder for a second, because that lady was the best minder. She reared our children better than we could ourselves, as it happened. But it was an English language house, and Alana then was mixing with other boys and girls that didn't go to her nursery school, and something changed. And for a long time, we spoke far more English. And I suppose the things we had to say increased in complexity, and though we always spoke a bit of Irish, there was definitely more English. But bizarrely, we're definitely speaking a lot more Irish now. And if we ever get together in an Irish language setting at an event, for example, or in the Gaeltacht college where she works, it's all Irish and it's effortless Irish. But I have a son, Keilcha, and he didn't go to an Irish language school because the advice we received at the time was that it wouldn't necessarily suit him. Now, we know now that advice was probably inaccurate, but at the time we wanted the best for our son, and he went to an English medium school, and he's intrigued by the language, but he didn't have the same opportunities that Alana had, that I had. But now, Alana, who is very fluent in Irish, sometimes she will insist that I speak in Irish to her, and the tables have definitely turned, because for a long time it was me insisting that that we speak in Irish. But it is interesting for sure. But one thing that has struck me with regard to even the next generation, my nieces and maybe nephews' children, their very confident in their Irish language identity, and they're not going to take the same excuses that we accepted, that you couldn't go to, we'll say, for example, the planetarium in Armagh and expect it to be in Irish, or that other centres, why wouldn't they offer their services in Irish? I have a feeling that the generation coming behind us are going to be more exact when it comes to their linguistic rights, which is very important, particularly in the north of Ireland.
Absolutely. And that's something that I want to get into in a little bit more detail, Réamonn. But before we do that, what I would like to do, and thank you again for bringing us through your experience and that wonderful relationship with your family, how you use Irish within the family. That's very insightful to hear that. But talk to me then about Gael Linn, because I was just making a note here and I was looking at it and seeing, just in terms of putting together the background for your introduction. And I see that you joined Gael Linn in 1993 and you're now the chief executive in 2024, 31 years later. It's an extraordinary career. But tell me about how that came about, because I think you said you started off maybe in the educational sphere, maybe teaching, and then moved into Gael Linn. So how did that become part of your life, and how has that evolved then as you progressed through the organisation, and that being such a significant part of your life's work to date?
Well, you're right. I trained as a teacher in St. Mary's University College on the Falls Road in Belfast. And then I went and taught in Bunskull na Fuishoige up in Twinbrook in West Belfast. And just as it happened, I was going into the house I was staying with a group of boys, men who are still friends. And one of my comrades, Brian Macaulay, said to me, "Do you see this advertisement here in the Belfast telly? The Gael Linn are looking for a cultural schemes executive." And, at that time, there were not many opportunities connected with the Irish language. And also, at that time, if you got a job, and it was a reasonably good job, you tried to stay at it. So people tended to stay for a long time. And as it happened, my contract was coming to an end in Bunskull na Fuishoige. And I applied for this job with Gael Linn and attended interviews in the Wellington Park Hotel, August 1993. I came home from the Gaeltacht to go to those interviews, and it was a fairly long process. I had to wait for a good 3 weeks to find out the outcome of the interview. But thankfully, I began working with Gael Linn in Armagh. And what was said to me at the time was, give it a go, and sure, if you don't like it, you can leave in a year. So as you say, 31 years later, I'm still here, and I have progressed. I've changed roles a number of times, and there's great variety in the work that all the staff of Gael Linn, and we have 24 full-time staff with Gael Linn, and not for a second did I ever consider leaving Gael Linn. And I still enjoy coming to work. I still have a fire in my belly when it comes to promoting the Irish language. And, I suppose sometimes I get to thinking that if I wasn't working for Gael Linn, I'd probably be doing a lot of what I'm doing anyway in my spare time. And I have done with regard to promoting the Irish language in the GAA, in the community of Armagh City, working to establishing on Culturland, which you mentioned in the introduction. It's very much all connected when it comes to me, and the rewards are great. They weren't always there's financially rewarding, but there was a lot more than, the pay. We were all on a mission, and I have a feeling that is still as strong as it was when I joined Gael Linn. We're all dedicated to ag laidrú agus ag glathnú na Gaeilge, strengthening and widening the Irish language in Ireland and abroad.
Wonderful. And Mashiv, on that, but would you mind at this point maybe just bringing us in and giving us a little bit of an insight into, first of all, what it is that Gael Linn does? And I mean, you talk about that organization, 24 people full-time employed there. What does that look like? What does that do? But could you also maybe, because this is something I sometimes wonder about, is we have various different organizations that we hear about in terms of the Irish language. And I often wonder how they fit together, how they relate to one another. We have like Conran na Gaeilge, we have Forest na Gaeilge, we have Gael Linn. We have a variety of different all-island organizations and international organizations around the Irish language. And would you mind just telling us what that kind of universe looks like and what Gael Linn's place is in all of that?
Well, I think that the universe, the Irish language universe, it's a better world. The planets are not colliding against each other the way that they might have been in the past. There's, I believe, a greater cooperation. There's greater focus within the various organizations, and there's huge goodwill between the Irish language organizations that you mentioned. Forest na Gaeilge, I suppose, would be the main funder. It would be the main funding organisation. It was set up after the Good Friday Agreement and replaced Board na Gaeilge. And there are 6 lead organisations, and Gael Linn is one of those. And each lead organisation have their speciality, their responsibilities. And in the case of Gael Linn, our responsibility is to promote the Irish language mainly in English medium schools, which is the greatest number of schools on the island. And we do that at primary, secondary, but also at a tertiary level. So the bulk of what Gael Linn does as a lead organisation is to organise opportunities for boys and girls and adults to use the Irish language outside the classroom. And that's very important to give a context, a meaningful context to what students are learning within the confines of the classroom. And we have a variety of schemes, north and south. Debates, that's our longest scheme, where teams get together and compete against other schools to win the Gael Linn debating competitions. It has advanced, and we have a special debating competition for Gael Scolanna, Comórtas Íchain, and a separate debating competition for English medium schools, Comórtas and Fiercy. We also have cabaret. I'm not going to say competitions because the competitive element at that age is it's not so sharp. So everybody's a winner, really. But cabaret style events for Gael Scolanna. And we don't just stick to the English medium schools, because we had some excellent programs before we became the lead organisation in and around 2014. So we have also Gaelic football competitions in the Gaeltacht for Gael Scolanna outside the Gaeltacht and Scolanna Gaeltachta within the Gaeltacht. And they're a wonderful opportunity for boys and girls at a very young age to get a sense of what it's like overnighting in the Gaeltacht and playing football. And it really is boys and girls, and it's a wonderful scheme. We have a commentating competition in conjunction with the GAA, which is great. Boys and girls get the opportunity to commentate in Irish on their choice of GAA men's football, GAA hurling, GAA ladies football. It depends. We pick 3 different games, different codes, and give them the choice. And so we also have a fantastic traditional music competition called Ciainsa, and the final usually takes place in the National Concert Hall. It's at a national level. It's very prestigious, all done through the medium of Irish. And we have a modern, a sort of a pop equivalent to the traditional music competition called Sclape, where they can choose a variety of art forms like unaccompanied singing or rock bands or rap. And that's proving to be very popular. It's a wee bit like the X Factor, only in the Irish language. And up in the north, we have public speaking competitions in Irish. We have quizzes. And, the bulk of the Gael Linn effort is organising opportunities for children, adults, and teenagers and university students to use the Irish that they've... Because that's one of the problems that we hear about. People in the Republic of Ireland will invariably say, "Oh, I couldn't speak a word of Irish," and it's not the case. If they've done the intercert and the leaving, they have excellent Irish, but for some reason they haven't had as many opportunities to actually use the language they've learned. And so, there are 2 other responsibilities that Gael Linn have as a lead organisation sponsored by Forest na Gaeilge. And the first of those is monitoring governmental policy, primary, secondary and tertiary level, north and south, in regard to the Irish language. And the other responsibility is to improve how adults learn and are taught the Irish language outside the conventional education system. And, we teach Irish. We teach Irish one-on-one or face-to-face, eye-to-eye, lahai. But also growing is our online teaching. And for example, Gael Linn is operating Irish language classes in the Celtic Junction Arts Centre in St. Paul, Minnesota. And there are 50 or so adult learners there at 5 different levels. And, when we want to take a rest for the summer and say, listen, our teachers need a break, they want to keep going. And some of them have reached a very high level of fluency. And, all in all, things are going very well for Gael Linn. We're just recently received considerable funding from the Department of Gaeltacht to increase our Gaeltacht scheme. And I'm sure many of your listeners will know of like the blue flag for beaches or the green flag for environmental issues in schools. Well, the Gaeltacht is a flag that schools at primary or secondary level can earn by showing that they really promote the Irish language within their school community, and they don't achieve Gaeltacht without a concerted effort. They have to earn it, and it's a wonderful scheme, and it's going from strength to strength, and it's 10 years in operation, but really is a wonderful scheme.
Wow. I mean, there's just so much to that. And I would love to just go into so many aspects of that in so much depth. And we have so little time. But I mean, okay, there's a couple of things that I would always like to come to with all of the guests here in the show, and I just ask kind of their take in relation to this. And it's really about the future of the language, but more particularly, the role of the Gaeltacht in relation to that. And I mean, because on the one hand, I'm hearing, a very positive message, and I'd love to just get your, if you like, your practical experience over those 31 years of what you've seen the change to be like in terms of what you're seeing happening in the education system now versus 31 years ago, and how that has evolved. And it sounds almost, universally positive from what you've said. But I put against that what we're seeing happening in the Gaeltacht in relation to the language and the decline there. And I know maybe perhaps that's not Gael Linn's constituency, but it's just something that is, I suppose, I think must be of concern to anybody who's thinking about the future of the language. So what do we think about that, first of all? But second of all, then a constant kind of refrain that we hear here, or I hear here, particularly in the South, and just recently I've seen it in the context of doing some reading, is this negativity towards the language in the education system here, that it should no longer be a compulsory subject, that there was recently during Seachtain na Gaeilge just passed here in 2024, we've had conversations and debates about the fact that it's a beautiful language, but we shouldn't have it compulsory in our schools. We shouldn't have to do it for matriculation into university. It shouldn't be, putting so much pressure on our students who are trying to work on a very difficult points race. And then, of course, that old refrain, we spent 14 years learning it, we can't speak a word of it. And I think you've already addressed that. So there's that kind of negative trope against the language in the South, certainly. Which is something that I hear continuously. But your experience seems to me to be almost diametrically opposed to that in terms of what you've seen happening over the last 30 years. So would you mind, that's an awful lot to ask you to maybe just talk about now, but just how do you see those different, in terms of the future of the language, the challenge that the Gaeltacht is facing, the opposition that we see here in terms of the opposition to the language in secondary school and its compulsory nature there. For instance, and just one of the things I'm seeing a lot of coverage now recently is the rise in the number of exemptions that are being given out for the language. And it's seen as kind of almost like a backdoor to get out of compulsory Irish, is that you can qualify for an exemption in a myriad of different ways now. How do you see all of those things, those factors interacting?
Yeah, I think that all the positives that we've discussed have come about almost despite of some of the policies towards the language. And it's the case, north and south, that the system doesn't always have the best interests of the language at heart, even though it should, even though it claims to have. And despite the many advances that are made in relation to the Irish language, in Gaelscoileanna, for example, the promotion of the Irish language in the community, the huge advances that have taken place in the Irish language with regard to media. There are issues, exemptions, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, and also the changes and the proposals that emanate from the Department of Education and their departments, their arm's length departments. You know, it almost seems as though whenever Ireland makes advances in relation to its first language, that some person or some policy maker will introduce a change or a policy that will knock us back a decade or so. And exemptions, it's not the only example of where policy is running counter to the overall sentiment towards the Irish language. But it is a very telling issue because it's led to a huge increase in the number of boys and girls securing exemption from studying Irish, and it's not necessarily for their benefit. Maybe in the case of a small percentage of boys and girls, it may not be their number one choice. But for many others, they seem to be finding out later on that, you know, if we had the chance now, we would have decided to actually study Irish. And exemption wasn't the best because it has closed a lot of doors in terms of securing work in the civil service, in education, and also culturally, you know, not being able to go to the Gaeltacht, just not being able to have that sense of being 100% connected with Irishness without the language. And that policy was brought in despite the concerns of educational experts, linguistic experts. And I believe that there is cross-party acceptance that it hasn't worked. And I hope that it's overturned in the next government. And, you know, you've touched on the Gaeltacht a few times. You know, there are many advances that have been made in regard to the Irish language. Many of the battles that you outlined, I think, have pretty much been fought and won. And every so often they rear their head, but they're more like a freak show of yesteryear. And most people, in my opinion, now are confident enough, have thrown off the shackles of post-colonialism, which has been holding us back. There's some shame that our people have not been able to come to terms with, and one of the outworkings of that is this loathing of one of the most important aspects of who we are, the Irish language. So many of those old hoary issues have been settled, except for some notable people who like to bring them up now and again. But, you know, Gael Scolanna have grown. We want more Gael Scolanna to be made available north and south. That's a huge positive. The media and TV, radio, that's growing. And the more you get in this line of work, Ahnartu Nachanga, revitalizing, which is a very strong idea, revitalizing language, revitalization. That's the terminology that I use when I'm describing what Gael Linn does. And I've borrowed it from the international approaches. And interestingly, compared to other language situations across the globe, in Ireland, we are succeeding very well. But we have issues that we're not succeeding in, and the Gaeltacht is one of them. I think that most rational people would agree that, you know, when you have a Gaeltacht, a place where the Irish language is the language of the community, and we still have some very strong Gaeltacht areas, and then we have Gaeltacht areas which are not just as strong. They're A, B and C areas. We really can do far more as a nation to revitalise the language in those areas and support the people that have been living in these areas, not just since the foundation of the state, but the people who have held on to the language in its purest form for millennia on our behalf, men, women, and the children also. when you think of all the developments that have occurred in technology and industry and full employment at the moment, one would have to expect that a country, and the blame can't just be left at the government, because, we get the government we deserve, really. But as a nation, we have to really and truly and honestly ask ourselves, are we serious about the Irish language and the Gaeltacht? We are in many respects, but when it comes to the Gaeltacht, the statistics seem to indicate that we're not achieving the results that these areas deserve. And, it's not any governmental department, because we have the best people with the best will in the world doing their absolute best on a daily basis. But there's something that just isn't operating at the level we need it to, because even from when I went to the Gaeltacht first as a student in College of Regis Ranafarshte, Connell, I can tell that the language it's on the decline. And maybe that's partly due to globalization and the effect of the multimedia bombardment of the English language. But surely we can do better. We don't have to look too far to secure evidence for policies in regard to revitalising the Indigenous language. I think Wales are way ahead of us. And we're not Wales, we are not the Welsh, but they have made huge advances since the time when the Irish language began its journey to where it is now, which is much improved in many regards. But there are some areas, and we've touched on a few of them, the policy in regard to language as a first language, Irish as a first language, Irish as a second language in the school system. Some of the proposals around oral examinations, the exemptions that we spoke of, they're issues that can be resolved. But the biggest issue that is causing people who work to promote the Irish language concern is the decline of the Irish language in the Gaeltacht. That has to be addressed. And we seem to be going round in circles decade after decade, but there has to be a better solution.
Absolutely. It just seems this, inexorable tragedy that we're watching with the Gaeltacht, the pressure of the English language, the pressure of housing within the Gaeltacht, the difficulty people have of just simply living there and continuing to live there and have their children live there. It's extraordinary. And again, I don't want to take away from the extraordinary positive things that are happening and that you're seeing there and that you're describing to us. But one of the things you did mention there is policy, and that Gael Linn has a function in terms of monitoring and perhaps influencing policy in various different areas. And is that something, what's your sense of that in terms of what you can see? And you must be very experienced in that area. Do you think they're serious about this as a government? Is there a coordinated policy? Because I see a lot of criticism around the fact that there isn't a really, comprehensive end-to-end education policy, for instance, that is really, where the dots are joined all the way through. And then we have the situation in relation to the Gaeltacht, and how does that fit into the wider kind of policy? And then of course we have the North-South dimension too. And I know we could have a whole 3 or 4 other shows talking exclusively about the issues that are there in terms of the Irish Language Act and implementation of that, so on and so forth. But just in terms of, let's say, what is currently happening in terms of the policy that's there, what's your honest assessment of that now as somebody who's been working in the area for the last 3 decades?
Well, it's a big question, and there are certain departments where the Irish language is very important. It should be a cross-departmental issue, and that would improve things greatly. And I genuinely believe, and we can all see this happening before our eyes and when we open our ears, that the amendments that were made to the Official Languages Act and implemented recently are taking effect. So we can see more advertisements in the Irish language. We can hear more Irish language on the radio, and that's a step forward. And in 2030, when the state has set out that 20% of the workforce within the civil service will be able to carry out their business with the population through the medium of Irish, that is another step forward. And, there are many advances and there are excellent people. It would be easy to tar all with the one brush, but it's probably more accurate to say that it's a mixed bag. The promotion of the Irish language is very strong in certain governmental departments. It's very strong in the north, for example, in the community. And there's, Gaelscoileanna north and south represents a very bright spot in the Irish language world. But some of the departments you would absolutely expect to be the guardians of the Irish language, north and south, are definitely not doing what they need to be doing. The Department of Education, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, they seem to go out of their way to find ways to complicate the promotion of the Irish language, the protection of the Irish language, the falling in love with the Irish language in the education system. And Conradh na Gaeilge, as you pointed out when you were speaking, have called for an integrated approach to the Irish language teaching from nursery through to primary, secondary, tertiary, and then into lifelong learning. That one would have thought should have been introduced before now, and the state in operation, freedom from the oppression of our colonizers for over 100 years. In one way, it'll only happen if the community, the people of Ireland, demand that it happens. But it should be the other way around. It should be the leaders, the policy makers demonstrating the best way forward. And, in terms of the Irish language, my general observation is that there are some departments that are in charge of matters relating to the Gaeltacht, tourism, sport, media. They're doing their best. And I believe that they are operating in a way now that has more financial backing, which is great. I think we're seeing that additional financial backing making an impact in the voluntary sector, and that's great. But the statutory bodies, and I suppose I am genuinely thinking of those in charge of education policy, the examinations, the state examinations. My sense is that they are behind the people who are way ahead of them in terms of where they want to bring the first language of the state. And up north, things have changed radically since, it's unbelievable, since Stormont got up and running there again at the start of this year, after 2 years where things were impossible, very difficult to progress any of your strategic ideas. But Gael Linn have met with the education committee at Stormont, and there were people on the call. It was a virtual call from all the parties, and every single person was very positive towards the Irish language. And that wouldn't have been the case even 4 or 5 years ago. But now I have a sense that we will see a commissioner for the Irish language and Ulster Scots and other community issues in the north. We will see those roles being filled, and think that there's greater openness towards the Irish language. We hear people who were associated with opposition to the Irish language in the past now making very positive overtures in relation to the Irish language and Irish medium education. So, you could see the North leading the way and becoming more like the great example we have in Wales, where they want to have 2 million daily speakers within the next decade or so. And they're well on their way to achieving that. But broadly speaking, things are a whole lot better now than they were when I entered the voluntary sector working on behalf of the Irish language.
Well, that is very encouraging to hear. And I'm just thinking, as you say, because it should come from the top. It should come from the policymakers. And I think we can't let them off the hook or stop putting them under pressure. But when we look at the examples of what has happened over time, it has always come from the bottom, from the grassroots organizations up, I think. If we look at Radin na Gaeltacht, came from pirate radio in Connemara. T.G. Cahir came from a similar kind of, threat. If you look at what's happened in the Dram Darragh and the community movement in the north in terms of what it's driving and producing, and indeed, I suppose, the whole Gael Scoileanna movement was originally a grassroots movement that came from communities just deciding this is what they wanted to do. So, I suppose that's where the future and the pressure is hopefully coming from. What we need to see are the policymakers maybe reacting to this and providing us with coherent, joined up thinking in terms of how we do it all. But thank you for your extraordinary insight into all of that, Réamonn. As we come to the end of our conversation, what I'd like to do, and you've spent now, you're in your 4th decade of community activism and work within this language that you have been so immersed in and have had such a positive experience in from the age of 8 or 9 years of age, and still doing it daily to this day. That's an extraordinary commitment. It's a lifetime's work. And just, can you tell us what motivates you in relation to that? What's your Irish language why? Why do you do all of that? Why do you continue? Why have you done everything that you have done so far? What motivates you in relation to the Irish language?
I couldn't not do it. It just had to be done. And I got up in the past and did what needed to be done. And in a way, I still do that, and it's very motivating when you're working on behalf of something so important as our native language, our Indigenous language. Probably the very essence of our Gaelic, Celtic spirit is held in the language we speak. And I have witnessed huge advances, as we've spoken of. I can remember a time when you'd be lucky to go to an Irish language event once a month. And now it's 5 or 6 Irish language events every night. And it's wonderful. I'm also buoyed up by the huge interest in the Irish language from across the globe. It's very impressive. And, you know, during lockdown, I think people had time to reflect on what was important. I know I did that. And I read some books that I would never have got the opportunity to read had I not that gift of time. We don't want to go through it again, but there were some silver linings with what happened. And one thing that definitely occurred, because the numbers attending our online classes, the Gael Linn online classes, doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And that's the same with Irish language learning in America, in England, across Europe. There's great interest in the Irish language. There's something special about our ancient but very modern language. And I suppose that's what motivates me. Don't get me wrong, there are some tricky aspects to the work that all of us do when we're working to revitalize our wonderful language. But more so than that, there's great joy when you see Gael Scolanna flourish, when you see more and more language on social media, when you see innovative projects like the project I went to help launch last night in South Armagh, in Bessbrook, where a young rap artist who calls himself Cuchulainn put together a music video and a sort of a mini documentary on what Celtic spirit entails. And it was very authentic. And it was made by young people, and I could sense that they all wanted to participate. I could sense that they got great joy in contributing to this very modern approach to promoting the Irish language. Video, Celtic Spirit, will be seen in the coming months. And I think when people see it, they will maybe realize inside about 10 minutes what they have always known at a deeper level. And that is that, you know, if we move away too much from what makes us who we are, if we cut away the roots that extend into the important land on which we live and move around, it's not going to be good for us. And people, I believe, can feel a little lost in this busy world of multimedia bombardment 24/7. And one of the things that can help people find themselves is definitely their language, the Irish language. And you don't have to be Irish or from Ireland to own any language, but in this case, the Irish language. Has anybody ever heard anybody saying, well, I started learning Irish at classes and it got me feeling very low and I had to stop them because they were just... No, you hear the opposite. I started going to Irish classes and I wasn't so sure about Irish when I was at school, but I just fell in love. And then we went to the Gaeltacht and I've started listening to Clannad and watching more of TJ Cahar. That's what you hear. And, I hear that when I visit places like St. Paul, Minnesota, where I'm going shortly to teach on Jerusalem na Gaeilge. And it is a wave of goodwill towards the language. And there's an article in Nosmag, which is available online, written by learners, adult learners of Irish on Gael Linn courses. And those people are conveying those very notions that we've mentioned. Some of them are even saying, I feel compelled now to work for the revitalization of the Irish language. And I felt that, even though I couldn't explain it, and I still feel it, and I can explain it a little better now, but, you know, Gael Linn is always looking for better ways to place the Irish language, Ilar an Éine, at the very centre of the market. And Gael Linn did that for over 70 years. They did it in cinemas, they did it in bingo halls, they did it in schools, they did it through people visiting houses and collecting money to promote the Irish language. They've carried it out in competitions and events, publications, and something tells me that Gael Linn are going to continue and identify even better ways of spreading Suscéal na Gaeilge.
Well, ná laga dia siv. A Réamonn a chara go raibh míle maith agat bunas ansoltas an scéal a rainn tú linn berbua agus benach de cara.
Gur céad maigat a inniu.
Thanks for listening. Go raibh míle maith agat as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.